Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. What is up, you guys? Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. Thanks for joining me for another week. Man, we are rolling through January. We are rolling through the 30-day animal-based reset. I hope that many of you will join us. It's not too late to join us for the 30-day animal-based reset at animalbased30.com. I am so excited about what an animal-based diet can do for so many of us. And this is our effort at Heart and Soil to make this as doable, as simple, and as translatable into your life as possible. There are lots of great resources, including an infographic that I built, podcasts, controversial thoughts videos, weekly newsletters. Check it out, animalbased30.com. And for the second week of the Animal Based 30, which began on Friday of last week, the challenge is to get more organs into your life. Eating nose-to-tail provides us with so many unique nutrients that help us reclaim our ancestral birthright to radical health. And that's why we do what we do at Heart and Soil. So if you need more organs, if you need more desiccated, that is freeze-dried organs from grass-fed, grass-finished cattle, regeneratively raised in the beautiful wilds of New Zealand, check us out at heartandsoil.co. We have almost an entirely full store. Beef organs will be back this week. And we have just been loving the fact that bone marrow and liver is back. Heart of the Warrior is one of my favorite supplements. It is heart and liver together. And I love lifeblood. I love heart and liver. Lifeblood is actually liver and spleen and blood. It's so cool because there are really no other desiccated blood supplements on the market, but there is something magical about that desiccated blood, and spleen is this sleeper organ that nobody thinks about, but is just so nutrient rich. It's full of tons of vitamin C, other peptides. So check out Lifeblood if you need more energy. Heart of the Warrior is for the courage in you, and bone marrow and liver is one of our foundational ones that just helps you kick a lot of butt and maybe look a little more beautiful, because it'll definitely help with that skin of yours too. So check us out, heartandsoil.co, for more nose-to-tail nutrition in your life, and join us for the Animal Based 30. This week's podcast guest, none other than Chris Knobbe, returns. He still hasn't seen many of the Star Wars movies. I've done a previous podcast with Chris Knobbe. He is an ophthalmologist. He is a board-certified eye doctor with a keen interest in macular degeneration. And as you heard on the first podcast, a fascination or a hypothesis, which I believe is totally true, that macular degeneration and so many chronic diseases are connected with excess, say it with me, linoleic acid, excess seed oils in the human diet. I think he's right. I think that he is right. I think the man is right. So this podcast is a much deeper dive into the dangers, the wilds of linoleic acid. This is for all of you guys who still are not convinced that seed oils are not good for you. That was the first week's challenge for the Animal Based 30, cutting the seed oils out of your diet. And now here's more proof, more evidence that it is really, really important to do this. So enjoy this podcast with Chris Knobbe. Chris Knobbe, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming back on.
Thank you, Paul. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
You know, we had an amazing conversation as part one that people can listen to. All the podcasts are at heartandsoil.co. And this idea of omega-6 fatty acids, linoleic acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, it's just such a deep rabbit hole that we had to come back for seconds. This is like Thanksgiving, turkey, and whatever low toxicity plant food you're choosing to eat with your turkey. And we're going back for seconds, or maybe it's Christmas dinner this time because we're closer to Christmas. But I think that as I have been continuing to consider the omega-6 landscape with linoleic acid, I'll just mention that there's no shortage of pushback to these ideas. As much as we present these ideas and this hypothesis that linoleic acid in excess is the primary driver of metabolic dysfunction for humans, there's a large group of people who think we're completely off our rockers. So presentations like this, podcasts like this get me super excited, because as I go deeper and deeper into this, And I think as you do also, I just become more and more concerned about linoleic acid. So I think continuing to add to the body of knowledge suggesting that linoleic acid is harmful for humans is beneficial for people. So just so the listener knows what we're talking about an omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid that is primarily found in seeds. And it has been made into seed oils, corn, canola, safflower, sunflower, etc. And it's in nuts, and it's also going to be enriched in the fatty tissues of animals that are fed corn and soy that have one stomach, or monogastric animals. And so I think for the majority of this conversation, I'm going to let Chris lead and sort of share with us his perspectives. I've got some new studies that I've found on linoleic acid that have been particularly fascinating. But I'm going to hand it over to you, Chris, and let you start where you'd like. And again, if people have questions, realize this is the second podcast Chris and I have done on this, but we're going to try and fill in all the gaps. So you only need to listen to this one if this is the first time you're finding us. But I think the beginning of this is really, where do we start, Chris? What are the mainstream nutritional views? Where do you want to start?
Great, Paul. So I'm going to go to my screen share, and I am going to use a PowerPoint for a lot of this, and we may back out of that here and there. But what I wanted to do in this podcast is to try to make this all-encompassing and not presume that people heard our last podcast and that maybe you don't know anything about nutrition, where I was almost a decade ago, which I was dumb as a stick when it came to nutrition. And let's start here. So, and then we'll walk through this. So for those who heard our last podcast, maybe for, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes here, I'm gonna quickly try to review that and just summarize some of what we went through last time. And so here's where we begin, is the fact that the mainstream nutrition organizations like Harvard, the Harvard School of Public Health, Mayo Clinic, Tufts Nutrition Department, American Heart Association, they tell us that these polyunsaturated seed oils, these vegetable oils, are healthy. And I am going to differ with that 100%. I am diametrically opposed to this belief system, and we'll try to show you how and why today, because I think these are extraordinarily dangerous to our health, and a great deal of my interest and research in the last 5 years has been dedicated to these. So the big picture really is that I think the primary drivers of obesity and chronic disease are nutrient deficiency and toxicity. So at the 100,000-foot view, those come from processed foods, and processed foods are really refined added sugars, refined flours, vegetable oils, and trans fats. That's really it. And so here's what we've talked about is 200 years of medical history, but a lot of people in nutrition research, this is what I started seeing way back when I began to investigate this, maybe in 2011 to 13, is graphs like this, where they show that Americans are getting the world is getting obese. The world is gaining weight, and they say, well, it's the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, 1980. And of course, what happened over the next decade between about 1980 and 1990 was our energy consumption increased about 250 calories a day. And indeed it did. And so then they show this. Carbs went up during that next decade and fat went down. And as you can see, this began immediately with the dietary guidelines for Americans. I did this myself. Paul's almost too young to have done it. But anyway, I remember the days, when we thought fat was the enemy. Carbs are fine. You just eat all the carbs you want. But what I'm going to show you here is that this fat composition continues to change, and we're replacing our healthy animal fats with vegetable oils. And so if you go back 100 years, 1900, the top 3 causes of death: pneumonia, tuberculosis, and gastrointestinal infections. Whereas in 2010, today, 7 of the top 10 causes of death are all chronic disease: heart disease, cancers, strokes, Alzheimer's, diabetes, those kinds of things, right? And just very quickly, I'm just going to spend a minute here because we could spend an hour just talking about heart disease in history. But in a nutshell, in this entire period of the 19th century, between 1800 and 1900, there was 8 published papers on heart disease, and 2 of those were thrombotic heart disease, meaning true myocardial infarctions, heart attacks. 1897, Sir William Osler published a paper. He reviewed his previous 21 years of hospital experience. Had never witnessed a heart attack. In 1910, he presented at a medical conference in London, England. He reviewed that in that past 13 years, he'd witnessed an additional 208 cases of angina, never seen a heart attack. In fact, the first published heart attack was by John Herrick, 1912 in the United States. 1912, and then 1930s, heart disease becomes the leading cause of death. Today, 2010, heart disease is kills 1 out of 3 people, nearly 32%. So how about cancer? Again, very quickly, 1811, in the town of Boston, cancer took 1 in 188 lives. 1900, 1 in 17 lives taken by cancer. 2010, 1 in 3 people dying of cancer. So there's, in this 200-year period, a 62-fold increase in cancer. Again, like I said, I'll just make this very quick, ladies and gentlemen. Type 2 diabetes, we know that in the 19th century, and presumably for all of history, incredibly rare. It was rising by 1935. This was the equivalent of the first NHANES study. Diabetes prevalence total was 0.37%. So this is actually a big increase. Goes up to 0.91% by 1960, 2.97% by 1991, 6.95% by 2010, and 9.4% by 2015. This is a 25-fold increase in type 2. Well, this is mostly type 2 diabetes. All of these numbers since 1960 are I think, type 2 diabetes, whereas the 1935 was not. But around 90 to 95% of diabetes today is type 2. So it's just huge. Now this is, I'm going to go back here to obesity. So we know from Scott Allen Carson's research that obesity, men age 18 to 80 in the 19th century, 1.2%. That's the number of men age 18 to 80 taken into prisons in Texas and Nebraska that were obese in the 19th century. And so back when we think, we look back and everybody goes, well, we're super lean in 1960. Well, guess what? Between 1900 and 1960, our obesity had already risen 11-fold. So then by 1988, we're at 23%. By 2005, 34.3%. 2011, 35.7%. 2015, 39.8%. This is a 33-fold increase in obesity in a period of 115 years. So staggering. And we're on target to be 50% obesity in adults in the next, by 2030. So in a decade, half of all adult Americans are projected to be obese, BMI over 30. How about metabolic syndrome? So just very quickly, I just want to mention this metabolic syndrome was described once in 1921 and 1940s. 1981 was really when this took on its current meaning. It was described by Hainfield and Leonard in 1981. And Reven in 1988 called this syndrome X. This is a condition of insulin resistance, visceral adiposity, abnormal lipids, hypertension, and what am I leaving out, Paul? But
waist to hip ratio, low HDL, high triglycerides. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so look at this. So in 1988, metabolic syndrome from the NHANES 3 study was 24%. 1999 to 2006, NHANES 4 it was 34.1%. 2006, adults with metabolic syndrome from the International Diabetes Federation, 40%. And 2009 to 2016, what we now know is 88% of adults do not meet 5 criteria of metabolic health if you look at their blood glucose, triglycerides, HDL, blood pressure, and their waist circumference. 88%. And as you know, Paul, and probably most of the audience knows, that Kraft's research back from 1970 to 1999 showed that 80% of Americans had insulin resistance based on his studies by 1990. 80%.
And I spoke about that study or that set of studies with Ivor Cummins on a recent podcast. If you look at the data from the Euro Aspire study, which Ivor and I have talked about, it was exactly the same thing, that when people were admitted for heart attacks, there was a subset, maybe 20 or 30%, that had known diabetes. And when they looked a little further, there was another group, another 20 to 30%, that had dysglycemia when they actually did the labs. And there was another group, another 20 to 30%, that had, impaired postprandial glucose when they fed them sugar and failed oral glucose tolerance tests. And so when people were admitted for heart attacks, for cardiovascular disease in the Euro Aspire study, only about a third were known diabetics. But when they looked for evidence of this metabolic syndrome, this dysglycemia, this perturbed handling of insulin and glucose, 80 to 90% of people had it, which is consistent with that 88% number of US adults who do not have who don't get A's in all 5 categories: blood glucose, triglycerides, HDL, blood pressure, and waist circumference. And I've cited that study a bunch of times. That 88% number is crazy to think about, and it's going to be relevant to this podcast and so many more podcasts that I will do, especially the one upcoming on LDL with Spencer Nadolsky, because we have to consider how if 88% of the population in the United States has some degree of metabolic dysfunction, could that skew the results we're looking at in studies? So that's something for the future, you guys. Kind of put that on the back burner and think about it. But this history that you're presenting for us, Chris, is just staggering. If any of you guys, want to be amazed, go back and watch this on YouTube and watch the video. But, your most striking slide that you've shown so far, Chris, was the first one with publications from Harvard and Tufts, like you said, that say verbatim, no need to fear omega-6 fatty acids. And these are the healthy oils, canola oil. And they show people pouring those oils into a pan. And so what I just want to make very clear to everyone is either we are right or they are right. But one of us is very, very wrong. Right. And these two views cannot coexist. We are taking a stand that is diametrically opposed to what the mainstream is saying, and looking at all of this really surprising history that Chris is showing us, saying, even though the dietary guidelines came out in 1980 and we got fatter after that and we increased 250 calories a day, we were already at that point getting much fatter since the early 1900s. And so the question that you and I love to both ask is, what the heck is driving this? So yeah, it really puts things in perspective. You cannot ignore these statistics.
Right. I know that Ivor Cummins has made a strong argument that insulin resistance itself is driving all of this. And but from my perspective, I like to go back further and say, well, what's driving the insulin resistance? And from my perspective, I think it's primarily seed oils. I think that is the big picture, but we'll get into the biochemistry eventually at the end, and I'll show you how I think that's working. So here we go. So I'm going to go on, and we're going to just mention that age-related macular degeneration, the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 65 worldwide. Between 1851 and 1930, there was no more than about 50 cases, 50 in the world. And this is when they were looking and could discover it. And today, this year, we are told that macular degeneration affects 196 million people. So once again, it's almost 1 in 3. It's around 29% and possibly higher affected by macular degeneration. So that makes up a huge part of a general ophthalmologist and a retina specialist practice. All right, interesting here. How about osteoarthritis? So this is a study that shows osteoarthritis has doubled in prevalence just in the mid 20th century. They say here, and I'll read this, overall knee osteoarthritis prevalence was found to be 16% among the post-industrial sample, but only 6% and 8% among the early industrial and prehistoric samples, respectively. After controlling for age, BMI, and other variables, knee osteoarthritis prevalence was 2.1-fold higher in the post-industrial sample than in the early industrial sample. And here's the graph on that shows what has happened in early industrial. So it's not like even early industrial people didn't have arthritis, but look how much higher it is today. So
and that graph is showing year for year. There's an age equivalence there, because I'm just trying to anticipate the arguments that people might levy against this and say, well, we weren't looking for things, or we didn't know how to diagnose these things. And I love that you point out with age-related macular degeneration that in the 1800s, we were looking for it and we could see it. And I mean, heart attacks are not subtle. We would have known if there were atherosclerotic heart attacks happening in people. And certainly our diagnostic capabilities have gotten better now, but it's not like we didn't see these things or they were going unnoticed. It's really, I think that's a really strong argument that, hey, these things are happening much more. And so I'm thinking with knee osteoarthritis or some of these other conditions, is the counter argument, well, we're living longer. I hear people say that all the time, but this graph you're showing is at any age range, you can see that the early industrial versus the post-industrial knee osteoarthritis prevalence is significantly different. And that's age matched numbers. And so though it's true that now in 2020 or almost 2021, we can prolong life with, but not prolong quality of life. And we might be living a slightly longer amount. I don't think we're actually living that much longer. And that many of the estimates of life expectancy that are changing over the last 100 years have to do with decreasing infant mortality and sanitation rather than increasing quality of life into our elderly years. So I'll just offer those as sort of counterpoints to arguments people might make to these ideas as well.
Right. And I just in the interest of time, I left that out, the fact that there are so many people that will say, well, we didn't live as long in the 19th century. And the reason for that, in a nutshell, is in the year 1800, 43.3% of the world's children did not live to see their fifth birthday. And in 1900, worldwide, 36.2% of children did not live to see their fifth birthday. And 4% of women in the United States in 1900 died in childbirth. So if you put all that together, this is why the life expectancy was so low, because if you take a population of 3, for example, I always say a man who lives to be 80 and his wife to 70 and their child dies in infancy, which is incredibly common, as I just reported there in the 19th century, for example. What is the life expectancy at birth for that population of 3? It's 50 years, right? And this is what happened. And I have that's almost an entire discussion to go through that. It takes a while. But back to the arthritis, folks, I just want to tell you that the whole reason I ended up in this space in nutrition is my own arthritis. Started for me at age 33 or 34. And it was when I was 50 years old, almost a decade ago, that I changed my diet and started and drastically improved my arthritis. And so another reason I threw this in here, because a lot of people are struggling with arthritis. It's huge. And so this has a lot to do with diet, and we can get into that too. So let me go on here, Paul. So very quickly, I will make this very quick, but over the last 200 years, I will submit to you that there has been an incredible global human experiment in diet. And this is without our informed consent, because I will assure you that I think if we had, all the time in the world to go through this, nobody would ever consume a vegetable oil or a trans fat if they saw what they could see the dangers of toxicity. But the big picture is this, that there's really just 4 foods that make up processed foods that's driving all of this disease. And they are sugar, vegetable oils, refined white wheat flour, and trans fats. And those 4 things have been increasing drastically over the last 200 years. Now, sugar has been available in the food supply for hundreds of years, but just between 1822 and 1999, it increased 17-fold. The first vegetable oil that the world had virtually almost ever seen, at least I would submit to you, 99.8 or 9% of the world had never seen a polyunsaturated vegetable oil until it was introduced in the United States in 1866, right after the American Civil War. And then we got roller mill technology, which is refined white wheat flour, in 1880. And eventually then, wheat. So then wheat became primarily refined. And the wheat is 20% of the world's diet, and 85.3% of that is refined, meaning it's nutrient deficient. But when you shear away the bran and the germ, now you've got a nutrient deficient food. So that's 20% of the diet right there. And then trans fats introduced by Procter & Gamble with Crisco in 1911. So that's processed food. And this all didn't start in 1960 or 1980 when we were told to go low fat. It started in the 19th century. And all the processed foods were in place by 1911, essentially. So you put those 4 together, and by 2009, our own USDA, that's their slide on the far right, that 63% of the American diet is ultra processed food. It is those 4 foods. That's what it's made of. That has no vitamins or minerals, and toxicity with the seed oils and trans fats are extraordinary, which we'll get into. But I want to go back to 1939, 1945. Weston Price and many researchers had connected all this, and nobody listened. Right, Paul? No, we didn't listen. And this is not taught in medical schools anywhere.
I can't even imagine what would have happened if we'd gotten nutrition and physical degeneration in medical school. I think it would have changed the course of so many doctors, careers. That book should be required for medical schools.
It should.
Yeah. And that's a striking statistic. 63% of our diet is processed food. There's no question why we're unhealthy. I mean, that's a joke.
I always said, 63% is processed food. And then Joe Mercola corrected me and he said, Chris, that's ultra processed food. And I said, oh, that's right. Because 75% of the US diet now is processed, and 75% of the world's diet is processed. And ladies and gentlemen, I won't say anything in this entire podcast that is not published science. If it's not published in the scientific literature, I'm not going to say it. If I do say it, I will tell you exactly what it is. So there might be one figure that I would present that's not published.
We're not making this stuff up.
No, I can't make up anything. Otherwise, we'll be thrown under the bus, right, Paul? I mean, we're going to throw under the bus if we say anything that is not published. So this is all published. Nobody can argue this. So here's what our own USDA shows us. Vegetable oils, 32% of the diet, sugar 21%, and wheat 17%, refined wheat, trans fats 1%. This is all as of 2009, right? This is the big picture. This is the all you have to do is get these out of your diet. But to do that, you have to make your own food. Now, I'm going to back up here to this incredible man, Elmer V. McCollum, E.V. McCollum, who did extraordinary research with colleagues in the early 1900s, between early 1900s up through about the 1930s. And this is his book from 1918. And McCollum and researchers did thousands and thousands of studies with animals because they really wanted to understand what was driving health. And this is just one example that I've shown in presentation. So this is two groups of rats. And the rats on the left, and I'll describe this for everybody that's just listening as they drive, is they said two sets of identical rats. And after weaning, so rats usually wean at about 26 days, and then they put them on this diet. And this diet was exactly the same: the proteins, the carbs, the fats, and the minerals and vitamins, with the exception of one thing. The rats on the left got 5% cottonseed oil as their fat, and the rats on the right got 1.5% butterfat. And the rats on the cottonseed oil, they grew to 60% of normal size. They survived 555 days. They're weak, sickly, fragile. Their coats look terrible. Their eyes are matted, red, and they're obviously they would be night blind, but they just wouldn't know that. And so the rats on the 1.5% butterfat, that's all the fat they got. They're completely healthy, grow to normal size, which is almost twice the size of those on the cottonseed oil, and they live 1,020 days on average. So they grow to twice the size, live twice as long approximately, and are infinitely more healthy. And McCollum goes on and says this. Now realize that in this day, 1918, in the 19 teens, they were just beginning to theorize what vitamins were. This is how they were figuring this out. And McCollum says, the diet must contain two as yet unidentified substances or groups of substances, which is, just by the way, those are fat-soluble vitamins and water-soluble vitamins. And he goes on, he says, one of these is associated with certain fats and is especially abundant in butterfat, egg yolk fats, and the fats of the glandular organs such as the liver and kidney, but is not found in any fats or oils of vegetable origin. This right here is enough to tell us, in fact, what happened if your diet is all vegetable oil, if that's where you're getting your fats, you are screwed, because even in adulthood, we don't need these just to grow. We need these to maintain our health. And he says that. He says right here, he says, both the growth promoting fat and the trace of unidentified substance in the alcoholic extract of wheat germ, ladies and gentlemen, that was B vitamins and C, are necessary for the promotion of growth or the preservation of health. They knew this in 1918, that the vegetable oils could not sustain growth and they couldn't sustain health. And this is what people are just don't understand, that you have to get these fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, and K2, and you can't get them when you supplant these healthy fats: butter, lard, beef tallow, animal meats, eggs, extra virgin, cod liver oil. All these are rich in the fat-soluble vitamins. You can't get them from these vegetable oils. And here's what they are. This is what we're talking about. Paul mentioned this early on. I'm just going to mention they're referred to as polyunsaturated vegetable oils, PUFA, which means polyunsaturated fatty acids, edible oils. I love the latest euphemism to try to confuse this, calling them plant oils. That makes them sound really nice. Omega-6, also called omega-6 oils, and linoleic acid, which is the 18-carbon omega-6 of these oils. And these are the ones that I think are the most devastating: soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, and rice bran. And Paul pointed out last time we talked, he doesn't like peanut oil and sesame oil, and neither do I. I agree with him 100%, but those are definitely better than these. And then, we can talk about the other oils: coconut, palm kernel, and avocado oil. Yes, all of those would definitely be better, but I could easily make the argument, and I think Paul would agree, that, if you wanted to keep it simple, get all the oils out of your diet. So we'll come back to that. But here we go.
Can I just pause you there, Chris?
Of course.
People always ask this question, so I'll just weigh in quickly. I don't know why anyone would have a plant oil or a seed oil in their diet when they could get them all from animal fats. People always ask me and say, what about olive oil? What about avocado oil? What about coconut oil? And I always say, why? Why would you use those fats? I would always recommend tallow, ghee, butter, if you can tolerate casein and whey. Animal fats are clearly superior in every way to plant fats. So I don't eat any plant fats. I don't eat olive oil or avocado oil. I don't personally like avocados, though I think that they're some of the least toxic plant foods out there. So if you're eating avocados, sure, but why would you use avocado oil in your diet? Why would you use olive oil? Why would you use coconut oil? Coconut oil doesn't make any sense to me because it's solid at room temperature, and tallow is a much better substitute, or ghee. And then, but the olive and the avocado, I guess people are putting on salads. And then I'm always asking people, why are you putting it on salads? Don't eat. Why are you eating those foods in the first place? So, if you absolutely want to eat a salad, then you need to go back to Carnivore MD School 101 and learn about leaves and these parts of plants that just don't want to get eaten, and understand that salad is not doing anything but making you fart. And it's not really that good for you. So there's no need for olive oil or avocado oil in your diet. And so you don't need salad dressing. Those are just not great fats for humans. And not in this podcast, but in future podcasts and in past podcasts with Peter Dobromilski from Hyperlipid, we've even talked about the fact that pushing a whole bunch of monounsaturated fats into your diet and imbalancing the ratio of saturated to monounsaturated fats may not be a great thing either. So that's a whole aside, is oleic acid versus linoleic acid. But what we're talking about here is omega-6 polyunsaturated linoleic acid. Oleic acid is a generally an omega-9 monounsaturated fatty acid that is still problematic, I believe, in excess for humans. Use animal fats. Okay, aside over.
Paul, I second and third that million times. Couldn't agree with you more. It's why do you need to use these oils? Personally, I'll just say the only oil that I consume at all currently is coconut oil, because I use some coconut oil, organic coconut oil tortilla chips. And that's the only thing. Oh, why coconut? Because coconut oil is 91 to 94.5% saturated fat approximately. It's very low in polyunsaturated fat. And as far as I know, it has not been adulterated with other oils. Olive oil and avocado oil, they are both severely adulterated. Now, we have scientific study, 79% of so-called extra virgin olive oils have been adulterated or at least don't meet criteria for a good quality oil in the United States. Most of these are being adulterated in Europe and sent over to us. And so what are they adulterated with? High PUFA seed oils. Why? Because they're dirt cheap. Good extra virgin olive oil, cold pressed, is an expensive oil.
Why do you eat tortilla chips, Chris Knobbe?
Well, I'll differ with you on this point, but and honestly, I do really well on a carnivore diet, but that's what we like to use for taco salad. And so, but anyway, that's an organic tortilla chip. But anyway, made with coconut oil. So,
well, okay. We'll agree to disagree there. Okay. I don't have a problem with carbohydrates. And when we get to that point in the talk, we can talk about what we both do for moderate amounts of carbohydrates in our diet. Corn chips wouldn't be my first choice, but okay. I just had to give you a little bit of grief on that.
Okay. All right. So here is, and this is published, the graph with not all the detail on there, but our graph, this is our published graph from our 2017 paper on macular degeneration. But this is what happened with vegetable oils in the United States. And this is where we went. This is back in 1865, no oils, right? And by 2010, we're at 80 grams a day. 80 grams a day, that's 9 calories a gram. That's 720 calories, 32% of US caloric intake. Now, you can argue that this is not corrected for losses, and that may be true, but even our own USDA finds that 24% of the American diet is vegetable oil. So a fourth and potentially a third. And you know that there's a lot of people not consuming anywhere near this many oils, so many are consuming more than that. But anyway, in 1900, 99% of the added fats came from animal fat, lard, butter, and beef tallow. By 2005, that's where this is. 86% of added fats came from vegetable oils, and we are sick and fat and sick and more sick, and we're getting sicker. And this is when the dietary guidelines were introduced, 1980. And look what happened. Vegetable oil is still going up. And this is where they end the data is in 2010, actually. And I think the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, has stopped this, Paul, to the best of my knowledge. I don't think they want us to have this data anymore. But it didn't just happen in the US. Here's what happened in the world. This is from Kearney's published paper. He analyzed all this, 2017, developed countries worldwide, vegetable oils between 1963 and 2003, they doubled. In developing countries, they tripled. And people in developing countries now account for most of the chronic disease. In developing countries, it's something like 69%. I mean, it's staggering how high chronic disease is in developed countries, but it's worse there. Japan, just as an example, 4.5-fold increase in their vegetable oils in that period of time, 40 years. China, about an 8-fold increase, 1963 to 2003. And here's the issue. Here's the comparison of dietary fats. For those who can't see it, coconut oil, butter, palm oil, and lard, they're all very high in saturated fat and monounsaturated fat, and very low in the blue category, which is the polyunsaturated fat. And then what you have on this graph is from peanut oil down, peanut, soybean, olive oil, corn oil, sunflower, flaxseed, safflower, and rapeseed. All this blue, staggering amounts of linoleic acid, omega-6 fat. That's what that is. And if you transplant yourself back to 1865, when the entire world didn't have these oils, this is where we were primarily getting our linoleic acid, is from these animals. And from the fat, butter, lard, and beef tallow. These are approximate ancestral levels, 3% in butter, 2% in lard, beef tallow, 2%. So if you look at all these oils, ballpark, they're in the 20% to 75% polyunsaturated fat range. Here they are again. Look at them. You can see, sunflower oil, 71%, and soybean oil, 56%. And some of them are even higher than that, but they vary. They're not all exactly the same. So here's what this did to us. So we calculated, this is the only piece of unpublished data I'll mention today. But this is from our analysis of approximate omega-6 fat in 1865, omega-6 linoleic acid, less than 1% of calories and 2.2 grams a day, 1865. Now, all the rest of this is published. We're at 4.84 grams in 1909. And I'm sorry, this covers up here, but that's about 2% of our calories. We're at 18 grams of omega-6 linoleic acid in 1999. That's 7% of calories. And 2008, 29 grams a day, or 11.8% of calories. So about a 12-fold increase in omega-6 fat in this approximately 145-year period of time. And this is essentially what the whole world has done. The world is just following us. They're just all behind. And
I want to just emphasize, I'll just interject this, Chris, that remember what Chris was saying here, and I've spoken about this before, in 1800, in the 19th century, 1909, we were eating tons of animal fat. All we were eating was tallow and butter and lard. And heart attacks were essentially unheard of. Unheard of. Macular degeneration, very, very rare. It's incredibly rare. All we were eating was animal fat, the fat that is vilified today. Because, and I've tweeted about this before, I really think that this boils down to what's the culprit here? This is the usual suspects with who's Kaiser Soze. And we're saying, is it saturated fat or is it polyunsaturated fat? Some people want to point the finger at carbohydrates. We'll get to that. But also remember, in the early 1900s, the rate of obesity was 1%, 2%. And we were eating lots of carbohydrates. I mean, we were not eating ketogenic diets in the early 1900s. We were eating carbs, but we didn't have diabetes. We didn't have obesity in the early 1900s. And we were eating things like flour, and those are not great things, but we were eating carbohydrates. We just weren't eating this many seed oils. So this is all associational inference, but it's quite compelling.
Well, I don't have the reference. It's in my book and it's in our published paper, I believe. But in 1879, the United States consumed twice as much wheat as we did 100 years later in 1979, twice as much. So again, I don't know the exact numbers, but the world is consuming 20% of their diet is coming from wheat. 1/5 of the world's calories is coming from wheat. And so people ate a lot of bread. They ate a lot of, in the United States, a lot of bread, a lot of potatoes. Those were very, very common food components in the 19th century.
And I don't think those are good things to be making the majority of our diet. I think we were primarily eating them because we were poor and they were easy to obtain, but they're not very nutritionally dense foods. But the point that we're making here is carbohydrates per se didn't seem to spark this massive increase in chronic disease. It probably led to a lot of nutrient deficiency, but something else happened metabolically, apparently with the introduction of vegetable oils.
Right. And here's the graph that this is our published from our published paper in 2017, heart disease deaths versus saturated fat or vegetable oil. And for those who cannot see this, there is an extraordinary correlation between heart disease deaths in the United States and vegetable oils, which both have gone up and up, from extraordinary rarity in the 19th century to, again, about one out of 3 people dying of heart disease deaths in the United States by 2010. But look at saturated fat. This is our data, and my colleague Maria Stoyanowska, who's a nutrition researcher in Macedonia, she gathered all this data. But the saturated fat, you can see, is practically a flat line for the whole century, the whole 20th century. Didn't hardly change. So how could you possibly, just this one graph, anybody in their right mind could look at this and say, saturated fat has nothing to do with heart disease. There's no correlation.
There's no correlation. If you did a correlation coefficient, it wouldn't even correlate. There's no correlation there. And again, this is observational data. We can't draw causative inference, but there's a striking correlation between vegetable oil consumption and heart disease deaths.
Right. But, and Paul and I neither one of us are saying correlation is causation, but the opposite of that, you must have correlation to have causation. You must have.
Exactly.
Right. So just for one moment, while we're on that vein, I want to, this looks like I'm just totally off base here, but this is a picture of Ronald Fisher smoking a pipe. He was the father of modern statistics. And he did not believe that smoking caused cancer, even though he was a brilliant statistician. But he argued that there were so many other things changing in the 1950s causing cancer, where there was more pollution, there was, a lot more cars, they were, tarring the roads. And I think part of it might have been driven by the fact that he liked to smoke. And but here's the point. I just want to say this about most of our studies in the last 4 or 5 decades is, what if everyone is consuming the noxious agents? And this is what they do in our studies. And Paul and I have talked about this offline. This drives me crazy. So you take a population from Cincinnati, Ohio, or Chicago, Illinois, and you take the whole population and then you analyze them and try to draw correlations and inferences about their diet, but the whole population is consuming Westernized diet. And it's like this, like if you have a population where you're trying to figure out lung cancer and 98% of them are smoking, how are you going to figure it out? You really need a population where nobody smokes and another population where most of them smoke, maybe, right? And this is exactly why Weston A. Price left the United States in the 1930s and analyzed people around the world, because in his words and what he wrote, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, was he could not find suitable controls at home. Why were there no suitable controls at home? Because people by the 1920s and 30s were already consuming these foods we're talking about: refined flours, sugars, vegetable oils, and trans fats. And that's what he correlated this to. So if we look around the world, and I'll do this really quick, Paul. I won't spend time like we did last time, but there's a number of populations around the world that don't have heart disease, like the 19th century Americans that we just talked about, the Chamane of Bolivia, the Ashe of Paraguay, the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania, the Tucasenta, the people of the Papua New Guineans of Tucasenta, the Catawans, the Tokelauans. And let me hit three of these, and I'll do this in just several minutes. So the Maasai tribe of Kenya and Tanzania. George Mann studied this group back in 1972 extensively, and their diet is milk, meat, and blood. And this is what convinced me. Way back in 2007, I read an article that came out in Men's Health, Paul, by Nina Teicholz, and I think she kind of followed in the footsteps of Gary Taubes that brought this to light. And the fact was that these warriors, they're consuming a diet of milk, meat, and blood, 3,000 calories a day, 66% of it from animal fat. That's around 33 to 45% saturated animal fat. And they had no heart disease. There was one out of 350 EKGs and 50 autopsies. There was one possible silent MI in the EKG group. But here's omega-6. And I want to point this out, is 1.7%. Now remember, I'm going to show you this repeatedly. Westernized diets are now in the 7 to 12% omega-6 range. And again, 66% of their diet, animal fat. And look at these guys. They all look like this. I've looked at 100 pictures and videos, and all of the Maasai just lean and fantastically healthy. And of course, this is where Americans are beginning to look, right? I mean, while we consume 24 to 32% of our diet as vegetable oils, and this is what the nutrition organizations are telling us to eat, right? And I don't have time to get into it today, but there's a bunch of experimental studies that show this in animals on isocaloric diets that consume these vegetable oils. They gain fat like crazy. Okay, Tokelau, very quickly, in the South Pacific. So these, again, published science, this is from 1970s and 81. And the Tokelauans, their diet was coconut, fish, starchy tubers, and fruit. Coconut oil, super saturated. So their diet was 53% fat, 48% saturated fat. And so here's what we can say. Well, let me finish here. So their diet is about 2% total PUFA. Now that's omega-6 and omega-3 together. So I don't know exactly what their omega-6 is, but it's probably about 1%, maybe 1.5%. But in 1982, men aged 40 to 69, none of them had any evidence of heart attack. So they have the highest saturated fat consumption in the world, and this is coming from a tropical oil, and no heart disease, while the Maasai have the highest animal fat, saturated fat, up to 45%, and no heart disease, right, essentially. So I think we can say saturated fat's not the issue. But now this is from Stephan Guyenet's published paper where he collated the data on linoleic acid in our adipose. Now this is not in the diet. This is in our fat. And we looked at this last time, but I think this is brilliant. So 1959, our adipose linoleic acid, this is omega-6, 9.1% in 1959. And remember where our obesity was in 1959? 13%. And where were we in 2008 with our linoleic acid in our fat? 21.5%. And in 2008, our obesity was something like 34%, somewhere there. Now, the only study I've ever found, Paul, that where they had biopsied the fat of an ancestrally living population and confirmed their omega-6, and it was the Tokelauans. They biopsied their buttock fat in 1968, and it was 3.8%. Now, I've got another population I want to show you. It's Sweden, and that was done back in the 50s, and It's pretty interesting. So, but anyway, this is where I think we should be with our omega-6 in our fat. And so this last population, I'll mention really quickly, the Papua New Guineans of Tukasinta. Their diet, 1972, published by Sinnott and White, 1973. They studied them for a couple of years. In fact, they've been studied for a number of years. But they're almost vegan. Sweet potatoes accounted for more than 90% of their calories. They would feast on pork and chicken. At times, they were pork herders, but they wouldn't kill their pork very often, just like the Maasai won't kill their milk providing cows very often. And so, but anyway, so here's their diet. And this is published: 94.6% carb, 3% protein, 2.4% fat, 0.6% omega-6. I don't think this is a good diet. I'm not telling anybody they should survive on sweet potatoes, but this is just an incredible finding, because this is what the researcher said. Population was lean, physically fit, and in good nutritional state. Absence of obesity and hypertension, no diabetes or gout. Ischemic heart disease was rare, if not absent. And by the way, no macular degeneration. I think it was 340 people over age 40, not a case of macular degeneration. And so I think that, the take home is really this: no matter, you look at all these populations, and Paul and I can go through the others someday, the Ashe, the of Paraguay, the
Hadza.
Yeah, the Hadza. Yeah,
I want to mention the Hadza, the Chimene. Yeah,
the Chimene of Bolivia. All of these. Here's what you find, and is that, well, they're not consuming any processed foods. No refined flours, sugars, or vegetable oils. No processed foods. Right? It always comes back to this, and so I'm just going to jump ahead to this. Is that so? This is what we see with the omega-6 in these populations. They're around 0.6 to 1.7%. Why are they so low in their omega-6? And the answer is no seed oils. Whereas Westernized diets, 7 to 12% omega-6.
So I would say they're low, and they're low because no seed oils. They're also probably low because of small consumption of nuts and seeds.
Yes.
And they're low because they're not eating animals fed grain-based diets that are monogastric animals. So seed oils are definitely the biggest contributor in my opinion, but eating a bunch of nuts and seeds is going to increase your linoleic acid. Eating pork and chicken that are fed grains, which a lot of these people are, if they're eating pork and chicken, they're not fed grains because they're just wild, they're just wild hogs. They don't have enough money to feed these animals grains. That's going to increase the amount of linoleic acid in the fat of those animals. So it really comes down to this ancestral diet. I want to add one anecdote to this story, Chris, and it's that I recently had Eric Ed Meads on the podcast, and we talked about his experiences with the Hadza in Tanzania, who live pretty close to the Maasai. And I'm actually going to Tanzania in February with Eric to spend some time with the Hadza. But when he was with the Hadza, he said they were all fit, just like the Maasai, except one woman. And he kind of looks at this woman and he goes, wow, she's pretty obese. And people who have heard the podcast will know where the story goes. But he kind of saunters over to the chief and says, what's going on? She doesn't look so healthy. And the chief kind of shakes his head, looks down at the ground and goes, oh, she's been spending a lot of time with the missionaries in the city. And so what do you think that entails? So while Eric was visiting the Hadza, some missionaries rolled up, I'm sure with great intentions, but the best intentions, are clearly killing the Hadza. They roll up and they're delivering food to the Hadza as if the Hadza, because the thing with the Hadza and like so many of these traditional hunter-gatherer groups is that because of geopolitical changes, they can't hunt the big animals anymore. They can't hunt elephants. They can't hunt hippos. They might hunt a giraffe if it moves to their territory, but it doesn't happen anymore. They can't hunt the megafauna anymore. So their diets have been forced to become more to contain more plants and less animals than they would ideally choose. But I think for that reason that missionaries feel like they're doing a good thing when they deliver them food. What do the missionaries deliver them? Seed oils, corn flour, and wheat flour. So this woman who has the same Hadza genetics had been living with the missionaries and eating ugali, which is cornmeal. I'm sure eating bread and things cooked in seed oils. And so there's your experiment. It's an N of 1, but there's a pretty clear experiment. Boom, this is the exact same genetics of the Hadza. You give them seed oils, corn flour, wheat flour, and they become obese. Can I just share one study, Chris? I'll trade you for the screen share.
Okay.
So just close it on your end. Yeah. Okay. So this one I thought was interesting because you mentioned the adipose tissue concentration of linoleic acid in the Tocalawans, and that it was 3.8%. And this is a cool study that I found looking at the adipose tissue concentration of linoleic acid in a study of Westerners. It's a cross-sectional study of 226 patients, and there was a correlation between the adipose tissue concentration of linoleic acid and coronary artery disease in these people. So it's interesting. These results are therefore indicative of a positive relationship between linoleic acid intake and coronary artery disease. Again, this is observational epidemiology. This is cross-sectional. But what I want to point out is that very rarely do researchers look at the adipose tissue concentration of linoleic acid. Our detractors, the other side of the argument from people who think that what we're talking about is nonsense, would be that if you look at serum levels of linoleic acid, they don't correlate with adverse events, but adipose tissue levels of linoleic acid seem to. And so there's a real discordance here. And the only thing I can take away from this, or what I conclude from this, is that serum levels of linoleic acid probably are not a great indicator long-term of overall linoleic acid consumption, presumably because some of that linoleic acid can become oxidized into the oxylipins, which we're going to talk about a little bit in this podcast. I talked about it previously with Tucker Goodrich on this podcast. But if linoleic acid gets oxidized into 4-HNE, 9 and 13 HODE, then you're going to see less linoleic acid in the blood. And so serum or plasma levels of linoleic acid are probably not good correlates for chronic illness. Serum levels are probably just not good correlates for consumption, but adipose tissue levels are. And that's what Stephen Guyonet's research suggests, that adipose tissue levels are rising. There's tons of research that shows the more linoleic acid you consume, the more linoleic acid ends up in your LDL particles, which is your cholesterol, quote unquote,
right,
and in your adipose tissue. So if you guys see people arguing or offering a counterpoint, as they should, to what Chris and I are talking about, and they're using serum levels of linoleic acid, we know those are probably not a good reflection. But if you look at adipose tissue levels, those actually do correlate with coronary artery disease in a small study of 226 people. So that's, I think, a fascinating point that I just wanted to add as a counterpoint. And there's a couple other things we'll get to soon. So I'll hand it over back to you, Chris.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go back to my screen. Those are great points. So again, we're back at this. This is where I believe we need to be, and with our linoleic acid. And so again, I just want to show this. This is where we were: 9.1% linoleic acid, 1959, and 21.5% in 2008. Now, so look at the obesity. This is where we've got obesity on this same graph, right? I mean, look at the correlation in the United States, obesity prevalence versus body fat linoleic acid. And here we go. If you would just, plant the body fat linoleic acid versus our vegetable oils, you can see the remarkable correlation. And actually, Stephen Guyonet's published paper had this very same thing. And then this is Stephen Guyonet's carb intake versus obesity prevalence. So when our carbs dropped off beginning in 1999, when people started talking about going low carb, why did our obesity continue to increase? Carbs are going down. I mean, carbs went down. They were and this is not consumption. This is total food available, which is why you'll see that the carbs were so high, like 500 plus grams a day, which nobody quite eats that much. But so this is total food available, but it dropped down to something like 480 grams a day by 2010, while obesity continued to climb. And we see it's even more pronounced with sugar. So by about 1998 or 99, somewhere in there, our sugar consumption, we're starting to learn that sugar is bad. Everybody knows sugar is bad, and sugar has come way down. This was grams per person per day, and by 1999, I think, is when we hit the peak. And so this is around 110 grams per person per day. And by 2000, wherever this ends, 12 or so, we're down to like 95 grams a day. Yet again, obesity continues to climb. And this is a graph of seed oils versus type 2 diabetes in the United States that Kate Shanahan shared with me. And I think this is in her book, but she's a colleague that Paul and I work with. And she shared this graph with me. But anyway, you can see the remarkable correlation between seed oils and diabetes and pre-diabetes, which has gone, as we reviewed, from 0.97% in 1960 up to, well, this is both diabetes and pre-diabetes both. So you can see they're almost at 50% today, or whenever this ends, about 2018. Right? So again, another remarkable correlation. And this is one of the things I was getting at, is I wanted to show everybody, again, here's this is a prevalence of obesity in males between 1975 and 2014. And I've plotted on here, again, our adipose linoleic acid, but this is a pretty interesting, this is one of the only other adipose linoleic acid I could find. And this happens to be in a developed nation, Sweden. But in 1958, their adipose linoleic acid was 4%. It was down there close to the TOC allowance, right? But now we don't have any obesity data going back that far. The first data begins in 1975, and their obesity was like 7%. So it was far lower than ours was in 1960, right? Again, correlates with their adipose LA. And by 1988 and 89, their adipose LA has up to 11.4%. And look what's happened with their obesity. It went from about 7% in 1975 up to about 22%. So it more than tripled in this period between 1975 and 2014. And those are the only two adipose linoleic acid pieces of data that I have for Sweden. But here it is this is the overall prevalence of obesity. So this is men and women both. Once again, this is just from 1980 to 2002. And you see that their obesity doubled, again, correlating with their adipose linoleic acid increase. And then this is young men, 18-year-old males. And again, we only have data beginning with their obesity in 1971, but their obesity was 0.9%. And again, their adipose LA in 1958, 4%. And look at their obesity in 1995, 3.2%. It's the obesity is the black number for those who can see this. And once again, with their rising adipose linoleic acid. I mean, you just can't make this up. So what I want to do is I want to ask this question. Let me get to this. What I want to talk about now is Paul, if I can, is using the example of Japan and Okinawans. The question is, do high carb diets drive obesity and chronic disease, or is it something else? So can I dig into this, Paul?
Yeah. Let's get into it.
Okay. Because I think this answers so many questions. By the way, I'm going to go back here for a second. I was criticized by one person when I presented at Low Carb Denver, because I presented the case of the Papua New Guineans of Tukasinta, and somebody said, well, he presents this one little population, consuming 90% of their diet is sweet potatoes. How's this representative? Well, I think we could, if you wanted to, I think you could take all of the Asians and look at this, but let's talk about the Japanese, because the Japanese is a huge population. It's like 130 million people. So let's talk about what's happened with them in the last 70 years. All right. So here we are. Everybody knows Japan's one of the healthiest nations. Let's talk about how we know that. 1976, men, obesity, 0.7%, women, 1.5%. Okay, it's by 2014, and this is, by the way, this is obesity 30, BMI 30 or higher. They changed that more recently because of the fact that Asians they're normally so much leaner than us. So they've changed obesity now, which they sometimes call pre-obesity, to BMI of 25 and above. But nevertheless, for this study, men, for example, went from obesity 0.7% to 4.3%. So this is like a 7-fold increase by 2013. And women wasn't nearly as much. Their obesity approximately doubled. And so let's go back here and talk about their health, though. Now, this is Ansel Keys' famous, or should I call it infamous, Paul? His 6 country studies of heart disease. But the point is the reason I'm showing it is he didn't make up this data. Japan was among the lowest of all nations this was degenerative heart disease. So it's kind of a broad category, but the same category was used for all of these. And even when 1957, when Yerushalmi and Hillebo looked at all the 22 countries, and as we all know, the relationship that Keys presented sort of fell apart. But Japan, I want to point out, still among 22 countries, fell amongst the very lowest in terms of arteriosclerotic and degenerative heart disease. And they remain there today, actually. They're very, very low in comparison to developed nations. There's number 14 over here was Mexico. And this is complicated, but Mexico was probably not anywhere near that low in their heart disease at that time. Okay, so this is really interesting because once World War II ended, Japan was in a devastated state, and we Americans occupied Japan beginning in 1945. And now, so when you start looking at data, the late 1940s and 50, things weren't very good there. And so people will make arguments about what's going on with their diet at that point, and those may be well-founded. But here's what happened. This is trends in nutritional intake. This is really interesting. So from 1958 to 1999, their calorie consumption, 1958, they had all the food they wanted. And their calories were at 2,837 in 1958 and went down to 2,202 by 1999. The carbohydrate intake in percentage of total daily energy decreased markedly from 84% in 1958 to 62% in 1999. And I'm going to come back and show you this. They had large increases in their protein intake, which from 11% to 18%, and fat intake, which was 5% in 1958, 20% in 1999. So let me show you this in a table. So look at their carb consumption. 1958, 84%, and this is almost all refined white rice, as you're going to see down here. And each decade, their carb consumption went down from 84% all the way to 62% by 1999. Okay, look at their rice consumption, 593 grams a day in 1958, 236 grams a day in 1999. Okay, so their carbs are going down, down, down. But what about their health? Look at what happened in the exact same time frame. Their diastolic blood pressure went from 73.5 to 82. Hypertensive medications, 1958, 3%, but 20% in 1999. Body mass index went from 21.7 to 23.7 in the same time frame. And their smoking went down from 68.5% to 45.2%. Right? Okay. So what about diabetes? So just between 1997 and 2007, 6.9 to 8.9 million cases of diabetes. This was a 61% increase. And these authors say the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in this Japanese population is not dramatically lower than in a Western population. As we know, Paul, the Asians are particularly prone to metabolic syndrome with our diet, right? And so here's another one. This is this paper, The Global Spread of Type 2 Diabetes in Children and Adolescents. And here's what they say. The incidence of type 2 diabetes mellitus among Japanese primary school children in Tokyo increased tenfold from 0.2 per 100,000 in 1976 to 2 per 100,000 in 1995. In junior high school children, the reported incidence of type 2 diabetes in 1995 was 13.9 per 100,000, almost twice that of 1976. And here's what they found in Okinawa. The prevalence of metabolic syndrome was 30.2% in men and 10.3% in women in 2003 and 4, and half of the men aged over 40 are obese in Okinawa. That's with a BMI greater than 25. So, and this is a study about breast cancer. So I'm just going to get right to the graph and I'll show you that cancers of the breast, colon, lung, and rectum in Japan all markedly increased. They went up somewhere in the range of like 1.5 to 2. Now, their stomach, you can see that their stomach cancer and their cervical cancer went down, and I don't really know the reason for that. I know that was they had a suggested explanation for that, but I really don't know what that is. But here, back to obesity in Japan. So here's what they said. This is what they say. And this is from the Asia Pacific Journal, 2002. Obesity has become a public health problem in Japan. The National Nutrition Survey of 2000 showed the prevalence of pre-obese males, 24.5%, and 17.8% in females, and obese, 2.3% in males, and 3.4% in females. So this is what's happened to them in this 40-year period. And if we here's the graph. So you can see that there's a marked increase in obesity for all the age categories in males. The females, not so much. They've remained pretty flat over this period between 1976 and 2000. And this is a study where they monitored the trends of obesity in Japan. And take a look. So this is men, overweight and obese, which is a BMI greater than 25, between 1980 and 2012. And you'll see that for every single category, these are broken up by decades, men in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70 and beyond, all obesity going up. Now, this is the shocker. Here's their calorie intake for 1997 to 2011, and I'll put these two together. But their calorie intake's going down in all categories with the exception of men 70 plus during the same period that their obesity is going up. So you can't even argue it's about calories. And this is what we see in experimental studies. So let me get to this. Now, this is our published data which regarded macular degeneration, but look at the vegetable oils. Again, we know 9 grams a day, 1961 in their seed oils, and that was at 39 grams a day by 2004, a 4.5-fold increase. Their sugar was going up, until about 1970, and then it's kind of leveled off between about 1970 and 1990. Actually it started going down around 1990. And so it's been going down ever since their sugar consumption, again, during the same time frame that their obesity is going up. And by the way, their macular degeneration in this 30-year period between the late 1970s and 2007 went up 57-fold. So here's some interesting stats. So with American occupation of Japan beginning after the war, this is the first time they got bread and milk in their school lunches. Never had that. Just interesting. The first time they ever had hamburgers and cheese. Not that those are anything wrong with those, but it was late 1940s. Their first fast food restaurant in Japan was a Kentucky Fried Chicken, 1970. First McDonald's in Japan, 1971. And this is an interesting quote I just had to throw in here. So 1971, McDonald's Japanese partner, his name's Dan Fujita. He said this, quote, "The reason Japanese people are so short and have yellow skins is that they have eaten nothing but fish and rice for 2,000 years," end quote. That's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah.
Okay, so by 2007, in 36 years, there's now 3,826 McDonald's, and 2012, 1,120 Kentucky Fried Chickens.
And you know those McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chickens are not using beef tallow. They're using vegetable oil, seed oils to make the French fries and make the chicken. Just throw that in there.
Of course they were, because they were told back in the 80s that vegetable oils were good. They needed
Exactly.
With the Center for Science of Public Interest, the SPI, told them back in the 80s, you've got to quit using that beef tallow to cook your French fries in. You got to cook it in vegetable oil. It's healthy, right? And here, for those who can see it, here's their first McDonald's restaurant in 1971, and here's one today of their 3,000 some restaurants. Well, here's a paper. An article from Japan Today, where they reviewed the top 8 fast food chains in Japan. Notice the biggies are Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's, Krispy Kreme donuts, and Moss Burger, which serves hamburgers and French fries, of course. And look at this data. This is fast food sales, and I wish I had this going way back, but we know that there was no fast food until 1971. None in Japan, none. Right? But here they are between 2010 and 2020. Their fast food sales increased 38% in this last decade. At the same time, their population decreased by 1.3%. This is their population in 2010, 128.1 million. And here it is in 2020, 126.5 million. They're having fewer kids. And so their population is actually going down. So here's the kind of the wrap up on just Japan. And then I'm going to talk about Okinawa too, if we have a little bit of time. Okay, so Japan, carb consumption, 1958, 84%. 1999, 62%. Their fat consumption, 1958, 5%. 1999, 20%. Okay, so if carbs are bad and fat is good, their fat went up 4-fold in this period, and their carbs went down about 20%, 25%. So why are they getting sick? But their high PUFA oils went from 9 grams a day in 1961 to 39 grams a day in 2004.
And you mentioned earlier that they're eating less calories. And this is an interesting trend, because in the United States, we see that, as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, that we are consuming about 250 grams more calories per day than we were in the 1960s. And so some who would argue with us would say, no, the main problem is that humans are eating more and moving less. Well, we certainly are eating 250 calories per day more. Now, the question, as I talked about with Tucker Goodrich in that podcast, was why? And one of the reasons may be, or one of the hypotheses for that may be that these high omega-6 oils, or these high PUFA oils, this linoleic acid, might be sabotaging our satiety mechanisms and leading to more consumption of calories. But Japan is really the interesting mirror for this, and puts it all in perspective over these similar years. They're eating less calories, gaining more weight, getting more sick, eating less carbs, and eating more linoleic acid. And as you said earlier in the podcast, something has to correlate if you're going to infer causation. Right. And carbohydrate consumption doesn't correlate. Calorie consumption doesn't even correlate. Polyunsaturated fatty acid oil does, especially. So if you're going to claim or suggest a causation, it has to correlate. So this really disqualifies a lot of things, and I think clarifies the carbohydrate issue. And again, just to kind of put this in perspective for people, I don't think Chris or I is advocating for a 62% carbohydrate diet. But what I've said in my messaging recently is, I get a lot of emails from people at Heart and Soil who are doing strictly hardcore carnivore diets. And I did that for a long time in the beginning. And a lot of people who are on strictly ketogenic diets, very low carb diets, or strictly hardcore carnivore diets do sometimes develop electrolyte deficiencies. You know what? Adding a small amount of the least toxic carbohydrates back to your diet solves that immediately. And I'm talking 50 to 100, maybe 120 grams of carbohydrates a day from ancestrally consistent sources, as I've talked about in the past. It just changes your physiology in a way that makes an animal-based diet much more sustainable. It doesn't have to be so dogmatic toward a nose-to-tail carnivore diet. A nose-to-tail animal-based diet with animal foods and the least toxic carbohydrates is so much more sustainable for most people. And what we're illustrating here is just that, hey, a little bit of honey in your diet, a little bit of seasonal fruit, heck, even a little bit of white rice isn't going to kill you as long as you're not over consuming it in terms of calories. And there's a corollary question here that I think I'll ask Chris and we can weigh in on in a moment, but those are not going to hurt you. White rice, it has had the hull removed. You can pressure cook it. Not everybody does great with all the carbohydrates, but there are less toxic sources of carbohydrates than corn flour, wheat flour, bread, high fructose corn syrup and soda, which has essentially no satiety point associated with it, and other problems in terms of the carbohydrates. I think that things like beans and other grains, oats, quinoa are all problematic for humans. For whatever reason, when you pull the grain or you pull the hull off rice, it seems to work for some people. It's not the only carbohydrate. There's also fruit and honey. And we just want to clarify that there is some flexibility here in terms of the amount of carbohydrates. If you go too high in your carbohydrates, you only have so many calories you can eat in a day. And my problem with diets that are this high in carbohydrates, a 62% carbohydrate diet, it's how are you going to get enough animal foods in your diet to get the micronutrients you need to thrive? I've talked about that before, but that's why this is such an important point, that carb consumption, calories, they don't even correlate with chronic disease in Japan. It's such an interesting example here.
Right. I really agree. I'm not advocating a 60 or 80% carbohydrate diet either. I'm not a low carber. I'm not a low fatter. I'm not a low protein guy. I'm just low processed food primarily.
I bet you are a low carb guy, technically speaking, Chris, because, if we're talking about Western definitions of low carb, you could clarify this for me, or we could look at the actual definition, but I believe it's anything less than 40% of your calories from carbohydrates, 40. So even when I eat a couple of oranges or an apple or a couple of tablespoons of honey on different days, or I have a cup or two of rice in a day, which are basically the only carbohydrates that I eat, I'm really not going to go much over 100 grams of carbohydrates, 400 calories out of what's probably a 2,500 calorie day for me. I'm well below 40% of my calories from carbohydrates. I am certainly low carb. And unless you're eating pasta, which I know you don't, I'm pretty sure you're low carb as well. Maybe just not ketogenic, which would be, less than 50 grams of carbs a day. So I think you're probably a low carber, but you don't know it.
Well, I actually been cycling, carbs a bit. So there's weeks that I'm really low carb, and then there's weeks that I go much higher carb. But again, I overall, I just would agree with you, Paul, that it doesn't. Refined white rice is certainly a nutrient deficient food. I think it's a safe carbohydrate for most people, but it's not going to provide hardly any nutrients.
Well, let me just ask you this question while we're here, Chris. Why do you think processed sugar is bad for humans? Because this is something that I think is at least worth a few moments of consideration. So, because I'll look at what I eat and I'll eat honey, right? And some of the ketogenic folks will lash back out and say honey is essentially pure sugar. And I don't get the same reaction when I eat honey as I do if I take a spoonful of processed cane sugar. But what do you think is bad about sugar? Because from my perspective, and this is going to ruffle some feathers, I'm not convinced that the sugar is the problem as much as the fact that it's in foods that are easy to overconsume and that we end up getting excess calories of it, which creates problems metabolically for humans, and the fact that it's nutritionally devoid. But the other carbohydrates we're talking about, specifically white rice, which is amylose, it's a polymer of glucose. There's no fructose in there. Or honey. Honey has a lot of sucrose and fructose. I've talked about honey being enjoyed by indigenous cultures. I mean, I'm sure if the Maasai or the Hadza encounter honey, they're going to eat it. But what's your sense of why sugar, or we should say processed sugar, might be harmful to humans?
Yes, I think that primarily the points that you already made, I would say probably the most important reason that sugar consumed, even in the quantities that Americans consume, which was way too much, is that it runs with processed foods, and those processed foods contain seed oils. And it's the exact same thing for wheat. So that wheat primarily is consumed with oils, and those oils are going to be vegetable oils. And I think those are the biggest problems now. And then you have to add in the fact that what you also already said, Paul, is that, well, both sugar and refined wheat, they're both nutrient deficient foods. So now you're just taking up more and more of your diet with foods that don't have vitamins and minerals. And you have to get all these vitamins and minerals. And when you are missing any of those, your physiology begins to go awry and things begin to degenerate. This goes clear back to the work of E.V. McCollum and Weston Price in the early 20th century. So, but that's my take on it. I think you can consume quite a lot of sugar. If your diet was otherwise completely devoid of vegetable oils, and you consumed 20% of your diet as sugar, and all the rest of it was really good quality. Let's say you're consuming a carnivore diet. That's 80% of your calories, and the other 20% is pure sugar. I think you'd be fine. The difference between honey and sugar: honey is a nutrient-rich food. It has vitamins and minerals in it.
A few.
Yeah. Well, I mean, relatively.
Yeah. I think I'll agree with people and say it's basically sugar. There's probably a little more of a satiety factor there just because it has a few more chemicals in it. But I mean, what you just said, Chris, is a very controversial statement that I would probably agree with. I'm not advocating for anyone consuming 20% of your calories as pure sugar, but let's face it. Like, I think that humans do better with a little bit of carbohydrates in their diet cyclically. And I'm just not convinced that a disaccharide of glucose and fructose, sucrose, is harmful to humans. Now, there are all sorts of arguments, and this is a whole separate podcast about fructose is toxic. Fructose is toxic for humans, and I just don't see it. There are plenty of studies that I've talked about in the past that when fructose and glucose are compared isocalorically, fructose doesn't seem to be toxic for humans. Now, what we know is that there's differences in the biochemistry with fructose and glucose, and there's no real break on how much of that fructose gets made into triglycerides. But so, yeah, consuming 20% of your diet as sucrose might give you a pretty big fructose load, but that might not be ideal. And that's probably way too much fructose for humans. Moderate amounts of fructose in fruit or honey are probably just fine for us. And I'm not convinced that moderate amounts of glucose in things like rice are fine. When I'm thinking about carbohydrates, I'm mostly thinking about the toxins associated with them. What are the lectins? What are the other toxins that are associated with this carbohydrate? Because I'm okay eating some nutrient poor food like rice because I'm just getting a macronutrient there, right? I'm getting my micronutrients from animal meat and organs, which compose 80, 90% of my calories every single day, nose to tail. And I don't want to eat a white potato because it has so many lectins and it has so many of these anti-nutrients, solanine, chaconine. And then I'm not going to eat wheat because there's wheat germ agglutinin and there's all these lectins in wheat that just don't play well with the human gut. I'm not going to eat beans for the same reason, all these lectins. So the more I think about this, the more controversial my opinion becomes, because now I piss off the keto people, which is fine with me. But I think that it's mostly about what are the toxins associated with the carbohydrate source that you are choosing to eat. Don't overconsume fructose in massive quantities, but glucose and fructose are molecules that humans have been exposed to forever. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly because everybody vilifies sugar, right? And we're doing a little bit of that. We're saying high fructose corn syrup came into the diet. But one of the graphs that you had early on in the podcast showed that we've been eating sugar since the early 1800s. And we really didn't see an increase in human, chronic disease until an entire 100 years later. So that's a century later. That's interesting. And again, that's just correlation, but let's just call a spade and really help people understand where the real issues are in terms of foods. And if that's confusing for people, I can clarify it in future podcasts. We'll move on here, but I just wanted to at least address that with you.
I agree, Paul. Almost probably completely. Don't anybody get me wrong, please. I am not advocating for 20% of your diet as refined white.
Nor am I.
Not in the least. I don't hardly consume any sugar. Sugar is a displacing food of modern commerce, as Weston Price put it, and it's displacing other foods. If you want sugar, you would be a lot better off eating an apple or a pear or a banana or something like that than you would sugar, because you're going to get nutrients out of that, right? This is where people go wrong. It's just part of the picture. So,
and when I think about it, actually, and I'll just add this and then we can continue, there's not a lot of I don't see a lot of nutrients associated with carbohydrates in nature. I see nutrients associated with fat and protein. But in terms of micronutrients, I can't think of a lot of carbohydrate-rich, micronutrient-rich foods. I mean, sure, you could eat an orange and get some vitamin C, but as I've spoken about in the past, I don't think vitamin C is a limiting factor for humans who are eating animal foods from nose to tail. I think of carbohydrates mostly as a macronutrient source. And yeah, an apple or an orange is going to have more micronutrients than pure cane sugar. But maybe I'll have to think more about this. I can't think of many carbohydrate sources that are particularly nutrient dense. Some people might say beans. We talked about why I'm not a fan of those in any way, shape, or form. So I don't think about getting my micronutrients from plants, you guys. That's why I eat nose to tail. That's why eating animal foods is important. The micronutrients we need to thrive, choline, the B vitamins, all of those nutrients E.V. McCollum was talking about, the fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin K2, the full spectrum of menaquinones, those are only really found in animal foods and associated with fat and protein. There's not a whole lot associated with carbohydrates. People will argue with that for sure, but we can save that for future debates.
Right. Well, with fruits and vegetables, you're going to get some B vitamins and vitamin C, and you're going to get some minerals. You're going to get minerals from vegetables a lot more so than fruits. But in comparison to animal meats and organ meats, fruits and vegetables don't hold a candle. And you can get from the organ meats, you're going to get that's a very rich source of the fat soluble and the water soluble vitamins. You're going to get all of them,
which is what humans really need to thrive. And, as we saw, and again, E.V. McCollum's experiments were on rats, but they're very analogous to what we see in humans.
Rats, mice are omnivores, and their physiology is extremely similar to humans. So they make great comparisons.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that people would often say humans aren't rats, and of course we're not rats, but we're not mice. But there's a lot of similarities there, and a lot that we can learn.
Well, they're omnivores, just like pork. Pork are omnivores, and so our physiology is very, very similar to theirs. So they make great comparisons. So can I go on to Okinawa here?
Yeah.
Okay, so because I want to, I know we're running really long here. I'll try to do this quickly. So I'm just going to try to focus in on Okinawa, which is the southernmost prefecture of Japan. It's an island. The city of Okinawa is something like 125,000, but the island itself, I think, has about 1.35 million people. That's what this tells us. And from this study, are they really that old? They tell us here that they do possess the longest life expectancy and the lowest risk for major age-related chronic diseases in Japan, the world's longest lived country. So they do hold this, or did hold this category. Between 1976 and 2004, they had 2,644 total centenarians. Like I said, here's the population of the city of Okinawa. And I don't think I think that's what they're drawing these centenarians from and not the whole island. But they do have a lot of centenarians. And so these researchers, of course, they're always trying to figure this out. What's driving this? Is it low calorie because they're nutrient dense, antioxidant rich, the low glycemic load? They're trying to figure this out, right? And I want to show you some data here because this is pretty interesting. Whoops. So carbohydrate consumption in traditional Okinawa, 85%. That's, again, this is, nobody argues this. And modern Okinawa, 58%. Look at their fat percent in traditional Okinawa, 6% and now 27%. And their saturated fat, 2%. Traditional was back around 1950 and now 7%. Now the 7% saturated fat, this is what the American Heart Association is telling us today to have our saturated fat. So their saturated fat is still it's about the lowest of any developed nation in the world. Okay, now in comparison, I just want to show, in the United States, our coronary heart disease is 6 to 12-fold worse than Okinawa. Our colon cancer, 2 to 3-fold greater. Our prostate cancer, 7-fold greater. Our breast cancer, 5-fold greater than Okinawa in 1995, just for comparison. So this is a study, again, asking, is it about caloric restriction? The diet of the world's longest lived people. Is this about caloric restriction? Let me show you this data because I think this is very interesting. So here's Okinawa, 1949. Here's their carbohydrate consumption, 85%. Total fat, 12 grams or 6% of their calories. And here's what I wanted to show, ladies and gentlemen. Look at their polyunsaturated fat. This is omega-6 and omega-3 together, 4.8 grams. Okay, that's 2.4% of their calories. So what's their omega-6? About 1.5%, right? Again, I always want to compare. Here's Westernized diet, 7 to 12% omega-6. So they're down there in the same category, these Okinawans traditionally, in the same category as the Maasai, as the Tokelauans, as the Catawbans, as the Papua New Guineans of Tucasenta, on and on. They're all down at that level. So here's, and here we go. Okinawa and Japan, both 3 grams of oils a day in 1949, 1950. 3 grams. Just for comparison, Americans were consuming 3 grams of oil a day in 1900. We were at 18 grams a day by 1949 and 80 grams a day by 2010. No wonder the Okinawans were so healthy and the Japanese back in 1949, 1950. And so here we see the table on this, again, showing their oils at 3 grams a day, which is 2% of their calories in Okinawa, 1% of calories in Japan. And sweet potatoes for Okinawa, 1949, 69% of their calories. It was only 3% of calories in Japan because the Japanese were eating white rice. So the big point, sweet potatoes alone accounted for 69% of calories in Okinawa in 1949. Now, people are going to argue that, well, it's because they were in post-World War II recovery. Let me come back to that and I'll show you that's not true. Here's what happened to their sweet potatoes. They dropped them like a bomb over 1950 to 1960, and their rice consumption and their bread consumption went up. But here is the big deal, back to this. So what I did is on our study here, I plugged in the oils. So again, seed oils, 3 grams a day, 1949, 9 grams a day by 1961, 39 grams a day by 2004. People are probably sick of hearing me say that, but that's where they were. And I'm just going to skip this. This is just in comparison to Americans. So, but here's all of the fast foods in Okinawa. And I just counted, this is from 2020, 18 McDonald's in the city of Okinawa. Kentucky Fried Chicken, 10 of them. Remember, Okinawa is 125,000 population, at least the city. And but they're just swarming in our fast food. And again, and I showed this before, prevalence of metabolic syndrome for Okinawans, 30.2% in men, 10.3% in women in 2003 and 4, and half the men over age 40 obese this year. I mean, in 2003 and 4, half of them obese. So here's some of their metabolic factors. Look at their BMI for Okinawans in 2004, 25. Triglycerides, look how high they are, 156. HDL in the men, 51.9, really low. Look at their diastolic blood pressure, 82. Fasting glucose, too high at 105. And look at their HOMA-IR, their insulin resistance, 2.8. What should this be, Paul? About 1.4, no more than?
Pretty low. Yeah, you want it to be lower than that. Yeah.
Lower. Okay. So, and Paul pulled this up last time, this study from Okinawa, it published in 2016, and he's on our side. He knows this stuff. Here's his graph. Now we're back at looking at Japan total, the whole nation, not just Okinawa in this study, but look at anybody can see their caloric consumption has gone down since 1950, confirming what I showed you. Their carbohydrate consumption way down, their protein stable for 60 years. But what happened? Their lipids went up. And what were these lipids? 39 grams of oils. And remember, they're only at 20% of their calories is fat. So guess what that means, Paul? I mean, I haven't done the math, but this is like 39 grams a day. 40 grams is 360 calories. Most of their fat's coming from seed oils. This is astounding. And look what happened to their diabetes. It went from, this is the total numbers, but it was like 300,000 back here in 1970. And now they're at 2.7 million people with diabetes. And so here, this is another comment, from another paper. And this is what they're saying now. This is from 2012. Quote, indeed, younger generations of Okinawans are losing their longevity advantage. We believe, however, that the most likely cause of this process is Westernization of the diet in Okinawa rather than the low caloric consumption of parents. And they go on and say, current demographic and nutritional data suggest that the remarkable Okinawan longevity is now a phenomenon of the past. Of course it is, because they're consuming our seed oils. And so this is a different paper. And they say here, Okinawa has among the world's longest lived population. Recently, this has begun to change. The life expectancy of men in Okinawa Prefecture fell to 26th from 4th among the 47 prefectures of Japan for the year 2000. The nutrition transition in Okinawa with regards to increased fat intake and increased body weight were set in motion either directly or indirectly during U.S. administration beginning in 1945. They recognize this. This is coming out of the Okinawan Journal. They know that it's us, but they don't know that it's vegetable oils. Again, they're attributing it to fat. And this is what they show. Here's their increasing fat intake, which we've reviewed a bunch of times. I don't want to go into that. And I'm going to come back just for a moment to their obesity. And you can see, I showed you this graph before. This is men's obesity going up since 1980. And this is caloric intake for men going down the whole time, with the exception of men 70 plus, because these men are maintaining, the older people tend to follow their traditional diets more so. And now this is overweight and obese women. And you can see that, I don't know exactly why, but they haven't had nearly the increase, or that really their obesity has been pretty stable, but their caloric intake has also gone down, the women. And so I don't really have an answer yet for them, and probably never will. But here I just plotted for overweight and obese men. This is the obesity up here at the top going up. And I plotted this year for year. Here's 1997. This is 1997. So in the same exact years that their obesity is going up, their caloric intake for all categories except men 70 plus is going down. Now that is powerful, is it not?
It's like, a moderate amount of vegetable oil is just a bomb metabolically for these people. And, the graphs might not look as impressive as people were expecting, but when you actually look at the amount of calories coming from this linoleic acid and how much of a signaling molecule 10 to 20 grams of linoleic acid per day can be in humans, it's a big deal. I mean, what we're talking about is the difference between 1.6, 1.8, 2% of your calories from linoleic acid and 10% of your calories from linoleic acid. So we're talking about a 5x multiplier, but that change, and even smaller than that. In the first podcast that you and I did, we looked at some animal studies that showed that, heck, at least in animal models, once you got beyond 5% linoleic acid, the damage had been done. And so I just think it's such an interesting idea that linoleic acid appears to be a very potent driver of these problems. Can I share a study real quick, Chris?
Yes.
So linoleic acid appears to be a very potent driver of these problems. And that's why it's important to understand your consumption of this. So if you stop the screen
yes,
share.
Sorry.
Cool.
So
this is an interesting graphic, which actually talks about the same thing. This is from the multiple risk factor intervention trial, the MR-FIT trial. At least these are the MR-FIT quintiles. But this is coronary heart disease mortality and tissue highly unsaturated fatty acids. So the x-axis here is the percent omega-6 highly unsaturated fatty acids in total highly unsaturated fatty acids. And then again, this is tissue highly unsaturated fatty acids. So this is presumably adipose tissue. And you can see that the more omega-6 in the total polyunsaturated fatty acids, the higher the coronary heart disease mortality. Now, again, this is observational correlation. And I asked people on Twitter, do you have any data that breaks this correlation? I haven't seen anything from people. You can see Japan here pretty low, and I'd have to go back and look and see when these actual results were. But you can see that the percent omega-6 as a percentage of your total polyunsaturated fats in your tissue correlates very strongly. The R squared, the correlation coefficient, is 0.986 with the coronary heart disease mortality. You can see Greenland here is very low, Japan, Quebec, Inuit, Quebec, Cree, and then all of the MR-FIT quintiles are up here on the top end. So I thought that was a striking correlation. This is from the paper, Diets Could Prevent Many Diseases. We'll link it in the show notes, but wanted to share that one to correlate with that as well.
Okay. How much time do we have, Paul? Do we need to wrap this up real quick?
I think that why don't we just summarize the last couple of bits? It's the mechanisms and stuff that I've talked about in the past. There's a couple other studies. Where do you want to go next? Let's try and summarize it for people and wrap it up.
Yes, yeah. I agree. I have so much more that I was hoping we get to the biochemistry.
Well, let's get to the biochemistry real quick and just talk about it.
You want to just do that on another podcast one of these days?
Yeah, I've done it before. I'll talk about it. Yeah.
I would love to present that to your audience. And I just don't want to try to do it in 3 minutes.
Sure. Yeah.
It's just so powerful. Once you've looked at this, and I never believe in going to the biochemistry first. If it doesn't fit with the big picture and the correlational data, then forget it. And then I go to the biochemistry and the molecular detail only to support what we see in these. Really, what we're looking at here is this whole thing with Japan and Okinawa today. This is a longitudinal observational study. So we're, as some researchers have put it, this is not a snapshot in time. This is the whole movie. We're looking at the data over, 60 years, kind of like you controlled it. I mean, couldn't get much better if you had a controlled experiment for 70 years with, Japan. But anyway, here's the end result. If you put all this together, you can see with Japan, the nutrition transition, and I created this graph. You can see their calories, from 1958 down to, from 2,837 down to 1,950 in this 44-year period. Carbohydrates from 84% in 1958 down to 56%. Fat, 8% up to 28%. Saturated fat was 2% in 1950. We don't have any data any of the other time until 2004, and their saturated fat 7%. Here's their seed oils. They went from 3 grams a day to 39 grams a day, which is a 13-fold increase. And their omega-6 in 1949, 1950, and 1960 was about 1.5 to 1%. And now they are at 6.2% omega-6 in their fat. So I'm going to just, I want to wrap up with just one or two very quick slides, Paul, is this. I just want to say to people, this, I have looked, and I'm sure you've done this too, Paul. I've looked at thousands of studies where they look at the fat in the study and they count it all the same, whether it's vegetable oil or it's animal fat. Just drives me insane. These are the furthest thing from being the same. I consider the vegetable oils toxic waste. They are pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient. And we can go through that on another podcast, and I'll show you why. Bottom line is personally, I believe vegetable oils and trans fats, and the trans fats are in the vegetable oils, are driving 80% or more of our chronic disease. And I think the way to fix this problem is basically this. You've got to get seed oils out of your diet. As Paul mentioned earlier, there's other ways to get your omega-6 up, and one of those is lots of nuts and seeds. And but the big picture is don't eat these fats. If you eat it, you eat fast food or restaurant food, I guarantee you, if there's an oil, it's going to be one of these.
That's a huge take home. And so what I tell people is, do a dietary recall for a few days. Look at how much linoleic acid is in all the foods you eat. And you want that linoleic acid to be less than 2% of your total calories, ideally. And so you got to remember fat is 9 calories per gram, protein is 4, carbohydrates are 4. Just do the calculation every day. For most people, it's going to be a very small amount. 2% of your calories. If you're eating 2,000 calories, you got to think that's a small amount of calories from linoleic acid, which is 9 calories per gram. I think most of us don't want to get that many grams of linoleic acid in a day. I would try and keep it to below 5. I mean, that's probably even a little too much. You don't really want more than 5 grams or 4 grams of linoleic acid per day. So how do you know? You're going to have to look at the foods you're eating and break it all down and think about it and understand, this has this much linoleic acid. This has this much linoleic acid. The safest way is, just like we're talking about, eat foods that are around 1.5% linoleic acid in their fat, like grass-fed animal meat and organs. Now, I just want to mention a few things. We will come back to all of this, but I want to mention a few of the most impactful papers that I've seen here. Chris Ramsden's group is amazing. I think that this is the piece that Chris Knobbe and I will have to come back and talk about more. I talked about this with Tucker Goodrich. If you lower dietary linoleic acid in your diet, you are going to lower bioactive oxidized linoleic acid metabolites. That's what this paper from Chris Ramsden's group is showing. There's no question that you're going to lower these metabolites. And if you had any question about those metabolites, the podcast with Tucker Goodrich is a great one to check out until we complete this discussion. And then if you have any questions about the danger of linoleic acid oxidation products, things like this, unsaturated fatty acids and their oxidation products stimulate CD36 gene expression in human macrophages. Well, CD36 is one of the receptors that's involved in the uptake of oxidized LDL and other problematic things in terms of the formation of a fatty streak and the beginning of atherosclerosis. So those two pieces that I just gave you guys are, number one, decreasing linoleic acid in your diet will decrease linoleic acid oxidation products. Number two, linoleic acid oxidation products will trigger macrophages to take up more LDL, presumably. And this is an interesting study. Low-density lipoprotein rich in oleic acid is protective against oxidative modification. In this study, they compared LDL oxidation of rabbits fed either a high oleic acid sunflower oil, so that's high monounsaturated, versus a high linoleic acid oil. Again, they didn't feed any tallow here, like I wish they had. But what they found was that when they fed the rabbits high amounts of linoleic acid, the LDL that they pulled out, at least in vitro in a test tube, was much more susceptible to oxidation. Sounds like a very bad thing to me. And then one of the last studies I'll show is just, there's been so much pushback to these discussions. And you know, I welcome the dialogue. Unfortunately, not a lot of it has been respectful, and there's a lot of name calling, but whatever. But a lot of the pushback against what Chris and I are talking about, like I said in the beginning of the podcast, is discussions that there are some studies out there that show that if you give people more linoleic acid, you don't see problems with increased oxidative products of linoleic acid metabolism. And Chris kind of subtly addressed this earlier in the podcast, where we talked about the fact that if everyone in a room is smoking, you're in a dirty environment. And if everyone in the population is eating more than 5% of their calories as linoleic acid, and we believe that the cutoff point for human pathology is somewhere between 2 and 4%, then everyone is already sick. And if you give them more than 5%, is it possible you're not going to see an effect? And so that's the counter argument. Now, I just came across this study fortuitously in the last few weeks, and I thought it was so striking. I don't know if you've seen this one, Chris, but what's so interesting about this group from Sweden and Finland is that when they look at the results of feeding people increased amounts of linoleic acid in their diet, they'll do a run-in with increased saturated fat. And so they kind of level the playing field. So in this study, which I'll put in the show notes, a high linoleic acid diet increases oxidative stress in vivo in the body and affects nitric oxide metabolism in humans. They had 38 volunteers who consumed a baseline diet rich in saturated fatty acids for 4 weeks. I love this experimental model. This is exactly what I would want to see, that they had a baseline of a diet rich in saturated fat. They took these people off of their high linoleic acid diets, presumably what they were eating at baseline, and they put them on more saturated fat. And then they switched them to a high linoleic acid diet, 11.5% of energy, so way higher than what we would want, or a high oleic acid diet, 18% of energy for 4 weeks. And they provided all of the food for the whole day. A control group of 13 subjects consumed their habitual diet throughout the study. So this is essentially a controlled, placebo-controlled, or a control group study. There's no real placebo, but you get what I'm saying. Now, the results here are fascinating. The urinary excretion of 8-iso PGF2 alpha, which is an oxidative product, was significantly increased after the linoleic acid diet, whereas the urinary concentration of nitric oxide metabolites decreased. That's a bad thing because you want to make nitric oxide for your blood vessels to be healthy. And no significant changes were seen in the oleic acid group, which is what we would expect. One of the problems we see here is that linoleic acid is probably much worse than oleic acid. And there were significant differences between the linoleic acid group and the control group for both the oxidative products of metabolism and nitric oxide. So what's so interesting about this is that they say, in conclusion, the high linoleic acid diet increased oxidative stress and affected endothelial function in a way which may in the long term predispose to endothelial dysfunction, aka the precursors for cardiovascular disease. So I just thought that was so cool that this group actually did a run-in with saturated fat and saw a very different outcome than a lot of the other studies that are out there. And none of our detractors, none of the people who would argue with us will show that study, Chris. But it looks like a pretty good study to me. They give people more linoleic acid. They have a saturated fat baseline. They actually tried to simulate some sort of an ancestral diet, and they see increased markers of oxidation. So when we follow up on the next podcast, we'll get more into things like cardiolipin and oxidative products of linoleic acid metabolism, the electron transport chain. I've kind of touched on these a little bit with Tucker Goodrich, so my listeners will be familiar if they can't wait for the next part of the discussion. But I think that we did a really good job in this podcast of just again, just talking about the history and the correlations, and really, like you said, showing people the whole movie, I don't really see how this is arguable. Now, literature gets complicated and people can use studies to confuse. But if we look at the evolutionary history, if we look at the anthropology, and we just look at the history of modernized countries and their intakes, it all becomes so clear.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I could do, I mean, that if you look at, for example, Israel, and I'll just throw this out, we could dig into this maybe next time if you want to, but Israel should be the poster child for following Harvard advice to consume vegetable oils, because they have higher vegetable oil than almost anybody in the world, and their outcomes are devastating. We'll get into that, but yeah, they're if vegetable oils are healthy, then the people of Israel should be extremely healthy, and they are anything but.
Interesting. And it's just, and I love what you said, this is an experiment that is being done on humans. We don't even know that it's being done. Right. I think in one of his papers, in that paper on linoleic acid metabolites, Chris Ramsden says the same thing. This is an unintended or unknowingly conducted experiment on humans that is completely evolutionarily inconsistent. These levels of linoleic acid, totally inconsistent. And as I've spoken about before, there are lots of papers. I've shown this one before, but I really can't show it enough. It's an interventional paper where they decreased saturated fat intake by 10 grams a day, and they increased polyunsaturated fat intake by 7 or 8 grams per day. And they saw an increase in oxidized LDL and lipoprotein little a. I just feel like that's such a smoking gun. You decrease the fat that's supposed to harm you, saturated fat, and you increase linoleic acid, which Harvard and Tufts and all of these people are just pouring into pans and saying, this is what's good for you. It's never something we would have had evolutionarily. And you see LDL undergo changes that are clearly, or I would say most people would agree, are linked to the precursors of atherosclerosis. So thank you so much for that, for going through all that in such detail, Chris. Where can people find more of your work or connect with you if they want to talk about linoleic acid or eat coconut tortilla chips with you?
So you can come to our website, Cure AMD Foundation, and this is at Cure AMD for age-related macular degeneration, cureamd.org. Or you can just look me up on YouTube. I don't do a good job of trying to keep all those things in one place, but you can find me on YouTube. A lot of people have gotten really interested in what I've been doing because of my Ancestral Health Symposium 2019 presentation and my Low Carb Denver 2020. That was this year. One other thing, I just want to tell you, Paul, and all the listeners that I was invited by Joe Mercola to collaborate on a book with him. And so we're going to write a book together. We're working on it now, actually, and hope to have this come out next summer. But it's going to be about all this that we're talking about right now.
The world needs that book, Chris. So Godspeed, my friend, because...
It's like I'm just a step above being a nobody in this world. And then Joe Mercola has this massive platform, where he reaches tens of millions of people. And so this is just a huge honor that I get to collaborate with him on a book. But he was so excited when he started seeing this research that partly I did, but there's been a number of other people that have done really good work in this field, like Kate Shanahan and Tucker Goodrich. And my hat is off to Tucker Goodrich. I listened to him a year and a half ago, and for the first time, and I couldn't believe the path that we had both gone down. But there's a ton of researchers, like you were just showing there, tons of researchers that understand this. They're just not in the limelight, and we are all collectively standing on their shoulders. So my hat is off to all those guys, like you just showed, Chris Ramsden, Martin Greutfeld in the UK, who did all this fantastic work with seed oils. There's a whole bunch of those kind of people that they're like linemen in the NFL. They're not getting the credit, but they did the fundamental work we're just kind of bringing to the public if you'll listen to it.
And I think this is one of the most important questions for the health of our population, and that there's no hyperbole in that statement. Which is healthy, saturated fat or polyunsaturated fat? And by polyunsaturated fat, we're really referring to omega-6 linoleic acid, because there is a diversion in there, in the research. There is a branch in the road if we're looking at omega-3 versus omega-6. People are not using omega-3 oils to cook with. You would never do that. So really, when we say polyunsaturated fats, we're really just talking about omega-6 linoleic acid in these seed oils. And so the question remains, which is healthy, which is unhealthy, saturated fat or polyunsaturated fat? Who is right and who is wrong? Because either Harvard and Tufts and the majority, certainly mainstream Western medicine, is advocating for lower LDL. That's the sharp end of this equation. They're advocating for seed oils, which lower LDL. And as I showed, you can lower LDL with seed oils, but increase oxidized LDL and Lp(a). That's not a good thing. In many people's opinions. So there's a real dividing line here. This is a battleground. We've drawn the line in the sand and said either we are wrong or Harvard and Tufts and all of Western medicine and the majority of mainstream dietary advice for the last 100 years has been dead wrong. And we really have to figure out the situation here. I don't think there's a more important question in medicine, and it wraps into autoimmunity, it wraps into lipids, it wraps into everything. But this is the battleground. Like, what is the paradigm that we are going to communicate to our next generation of medical students and doctors? Because this, I believe, is killing people, and we're trying to change that. So thanks for being a part of that, Chris.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate it.
What is up, you guys? Thanks for listening to the end of the podcast. This is where I kind of ramble a little bit. I've got my rambling space in the outro to tell you whatever's on my mind, but it's been an amazing Animal Based 30. I hope you will all join us for that at animalbased30.com. Next week's podcast is going to blow your mind. I had my buddy Sean O'Mara, who is previously an emergency room doctor and now does research looking at MRI images of visceral fat and the arteries in people's brains. And he's seen some incredible reversal of visceral fat with an animal-based diet and reversal of atherosclerosis, plaque formation in the brain, with the same type of eating, cutting out processed carbohydrates and seed oils. How cool is that? You can reverse atherosclerosis. You can. And so that one is going to blow your mind. You know what else will blow your mind? How good you're going to feel when you get organs in your life and you eat an animal-based diet. If you need more organs, check us out at heartandsoil.co. We're going to have a full store later this week, guys, or pretty darn close to it. Beef organs is coming back. That's your favorite. And we've got a lot of it this time. We're going to try and keep it in stock in perpetuity. But I love my bone marrow and liver, lifeblood, heart of the warrior. There's so many good ones. Immunomilk, gut and digestion, like you heard last week with Lucy Mailing. So much nutrition there in the store for you. Shoot me an email, Dr. Paul, drpaul at heartandsoil.co, if you have questions about which one of those might be best for you or how to construct an animal-based diet. All right. I want to give a shout out to my other sponsors as well. WhiteOakPastures.com, the kings and queens of regenerative agriculture. Belcampo.com, amazing people. Anya Fernald, the chief cowgirl CEO at Belcampo, has been on the podcast. They're really doing great work there in Northern California and making some amazing meat in addition to White Oak. Both of those places use the code CarnivoreMD. I love supporting regenerative farms. I love it. It feels so good. That's what's important that we do in our lives if we care about where our meat comes from and nourishing the soil. You can also check out forceofnaturemeats.com, another company I love. They don't even sponsor the podcast, and I love them so much. But they do amazing stuff. They're connected with Rome Ranch here in Texas. They have awesome. My favorite there is the ancestral grind with the bison. And I love the folks at Blue Blocks, BLUBLOX.com. Good people making amazing blue blocking glasses. Carnivore MD is the code there. And then if you want to get into hunting, you should check out my buddy Monsell. I saw him the other day at a Christmas party, gave him a high five. He said the hunts have been going really good. Check out sacredhunting.com/Paul. And you will not be disappointed. It's a combination of hunting and spirituality, which I think is as it all should be all the time. Just tell him Paul sent you and enjoy your hunt with Monsell. I think more and more people hunting means more and more respect for the land and the ecosystems and how it's all connected. And that is what we need to persist as humans. That is a big part of the remembering, you guys. The remembering. So you can sign up for my newsletter at heartandsoil.co. That goes out every Sunday. During this month, we're sending out the Animal-Based 30 emails on Friday. And so there's lots of good stuff coming from me. If you didn't get it, you can sign up for the Animal-Based 30 and you'll get a free animal-based infographic, which I spent a ton of time on developing, just all kinds of important stuff to make it so simple to eat an animal-based diet, the diet that reverses atherosclerosis in imaging, as you'll see next week in the podcast, and that will reverse visceral adipose tissue, which is such a clear indication of metabolic dysfunction. How do you heal insulin resistance? You eat an animal-based diet, eliminate processed carbs and seed oils, and bazoom, bazinga, that will be gone. And that will change the course of human history on this planet. I know, believe me. All right, guys, love you all. Thanks for being a part of the remembering. Stay radical.